So let's talk about, well, sort of how we got here, really, I suppose, with my next guest. That is Laura Dodsworth. She's a journalist and photographer. She's also author of a brand new book called A State of Fear, How the UK Government Weaponised Our Fear During the COVID Epidemic. Good morning to you, Laura.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, this book, I was seeing you online talking about this. Now, you've been someone who's been campaigning against lockdowns and certainly urging the easing at the earliest possible opportunity. You decided to write this book because you were hearing from sources that actually, so much of what has happened in the last year has been as a result of scaremongering and overplaying threats and people being, frankly, terrified out of their minds and terrified into their homes. And even with the relaxations that we've had in April and this month and next month, millions of people really too scared to actually take part, to go to the theatre, to go to a cinema, to go on holiday, and saying, oh no, they're just not willing to do it, even after they've been vaccinated. And you've put this down to what, to all intents and purposes, been propaganda. What have you discovered?
Yeah, it's so interesting today, isn't it? This is the day when restrictions are being relaxed, and it should be a day for celebration. But, at the same time, there's this widespread suspicion that the latest modelling, which was released from SAGE, which had some quite extraordinary predictions for hospitalizations and deaths this summer, and also the talk about so-called variants like the Indian variant, are actually psychological nudges to encourage us to keep following the rules, to keep fear levels high, even if it's supposedly for our own good. So I think the story of the last year would look on the face of it to be about an epidemic. But for me, my journalistic investigation took me into a completely different story, which is a story of fear. Behavioural psychology is now very deeply embedded in government. It's how the government does things. It's how they get us to change our ways, to become model citizens and to follow rules. And one of the big learnings for me in this book is not just how they've used fear supposedly in our best interests to make us follow lockdown rules, it's how much behavioural psychology is part of how the government relates to us.
Yeah.
There was a really extraordinary document that was released last year, dated March 22nd, where the behavioural scientists who report into SAGE and the government said that some people were too complacent because they understood that the risk of death was low for their age. And so what they recommended doing was raising the sense of threat for everybody to encourage us to follow the rules.
And that's
an open admission.
This was members of the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, SPI-B, is that how we pronounce that? They were
well done for spelling out.
They were officially asked, how do we go about trying to change people's behaviour? What do we need to do to get people to go along with this? And there was this real concern. We know from former, other SAGE minutes that we've seen from last year, that their view was that we wouldn't get enough people conforming to lockdown. And as it was, when we did actually finally go into lockdown, the 23rd of March, actually there was far more compliance than the government had ever not just predicted, but indeed had ever wanted, in terms of basically every business closed down unless it was an absolute essential. Everyone was staying at home, and they predicted, people kept their kids away from school, even they were key workers and the like, and it was a much bigger level of compliance than ever expected. And a lot of this is down to the tactics that were used, which you've in your book likened to sort of wartime levels of propaganda.
Absolutely. And actually that martial language started in what I call Fright Night, the night that Boris Johnson gave his speech to the nation. I've gone back and I've analysed the language and also his body language with a couple of body language experts. And it was very martial, it really evokes the Blitz spirit. That's not just about a kind of a we're in it together thing, but also war is a bitter pill. You have to take your medicine. It's about obeying. It's about doing your part. So it really started then. And, we've heard it called the China virus, or that it's the greatest threat in peacetime. There's a lot of warlike language, actually, which is partly to convey the severity of the threat, but also to make people knuckle down.
Yeah.
And again, do their part to be good little soldiers. We've counted the fallen all the way through, except this time we were the fallen. Normally the death count's or the end of war, but we've been doing it on a daily basis, which
Yeah,
of course is part of the doom mongering.
almost hourly. And you can almost see the disappointment on the BBC and Sky and others when they announce when it's, I mean, again, any death is very sad of anything, not just COVID. And in some days you have 4 deaths announced or 11 deaths announced, and you can almost hear the disappointment in their voices because, it's not very high today. And yet they're still reporting it. But of course they don't report all the deaths from cancer and untreated heart disease and the suicides and the like. But this is the interesting thing. This wasn't that our population became very, very scared from a terrible, terrible threat of a virus that was killing. We've seen excess deaths. This was and is and will remain a real virus that does kill. Let's not pretend it's not serious. But it was totally and deliberately overblown. So while there was and remains a serious risk to people who are elderly or frail or vulnerable, and I was always concerned for my family members, my older family members, and for anyone else in our society who's vulnerable, it was never a big risk to children, to teenagers, people in their 20s or 30s, and frankly, to someone healthy in my age bracket, their early 50s, not a particularly big risk either. I was pretty ill for 3 weeks, but certainly well enough, certainly to work from home during that time. And most of the people I know who've had COVID have recovered just fine, thank you very much. Just still can't taste a few different foods, and frankly consider that to be not the biggest problem in their lives. But they wanted, the government set out and the scientists set out to make us all as equally frightened, despite the fact that our risks were not remotely equal.
Well, this is not an uncommon thing these days in public health. There's a democratization of risk. They want everybody to feel at risk. And like you, I do not want to refute that COVID is a serious disease. I set that out right at the beginning of the book. This isn't a conspiracy theory, but COVID's a real virus, a disease, and it's made people ill. But the point is they wanted everybody to feel at risk, to make us follow the rules. This paper, this SPI-B paper, wouldn't have existed without the question. And the question is based in the government's fears. People won't follow the rules. I interviewed SPI-B advisors for the book, and one of them said, we didn't know how people would react to not being able to go to the pub or not be able to go to football. And actually, this is interesting. There's a very classist thing here. It's like, how will those people cope without those things they do? And there's lots of ways that they did it. We talked about the death figures. Well, like you just said, Julia, they were given without the context that about 1,600 people die every day in the UK on average, and more people die in the winter. The biggest numbers have always floated to the top like cream in the news. So whether it's cases or hospitalizations or deaths, whatever's the most dramatic news comes to the top. The data is also lumpy. So on a day when a bigger number die, mainly because of a delay in death registrations, that number gets quoted, but never the smaller number the day before. Also, the advertising. I mean, when you look back at it and review it, it's really easy to see in hindsight what was happening. It's often black and white, very grainy, a little bit like an upscale Blair Witch Project. Lots of use of yellow and black chevrons like disaster cordons or wasps, do not cross, danger, this will hurt. The use of statistics and modelling. I just referred to the SAGE report. I think their mid-range report is that there'll be 10,000 hospital admissions per day in mid-July. And this frankly makes no sense. All the vulnerable will be vaccinated, and we'll be in the midst of summer when respiratory diseases are not abounding.
Yeah, I mean, but yet that data is taken seriously in government.
Well, I think what the problem is that ultimately people do not want to live in a state of fear, and they do not want to be manipulated.
You say that. I don't agree with you. I think a lot of people have, for want of a better word, it doesn't feel quite right, enjoyed on some level being part of something. There was a wonderful camaraderie in the first few months, well, the first few weeks at least last year, wasn't there? And people were all in it together. But again, people thought it was just be for a few weeks. And then the fear set in, and then people got used to not having freedoms and seemed to think that anyone who was enjoying any freedom at all was automatically going to kill 10,000 old people. But there are now so many people who are so afraid. They've gone from sort of enjoying the camaraderie to just genuinely being fearful leaving their homes. It's the people skulking along the street wearing a mask still after being double vaccinated.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a few things I'd say in response to that. First of all, the book is not just an expose of interviews with government advisors and psychologists. I've also interviewed people who've been impacted by fear. That was really important to me. So I've interviewed people who have developed agoraphobia, OCDs, self-harm, attempted suicide, as a result of this campaign of fear and the anxiety and loneliness caused by lockdown. So really, not everybody's enjoying this. But yes, I hear you. There are some people who may have actually had some improvements in their life as a result of lockdown. And there is also something about fear. Look, some people like scary roller coasters and films, and it does do something to you, and it does do something to the body. And I've also explored these theories and interviewed people about that in the book. But overall, people do not want to be manipulated. And the problem with the kind of worst case scenarios and the constant egging up of variants is that people lose trust in the government and in public health messaging. And that's very dangerous long-term to the government brand.
And very dangerous to the scientists as well. Let's also pretend that there is just one the science as opposed to many different dissenting views. And when people who have a dissenting view based on data are then threatened with losing their job, and we're in very dangerous territory indeed. It's a brilliant book. It's a really brave book. Laura Dodsworth, I really appreciate you joining us. Her book is called A State of Fear, and it is out